A blind dog undergoes surgery to restore his sight, a moment his owner has been dreaming of for years. But when the bandages come off, and the dog finally opens his eyes, he freezes. His tail doesn't wag. Instead, he backs away, confused and distant, as if he doesn't recognize the person who saved him. What's the reason for his strange reaction? And what happens when the truth about their shared past comes to light? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun painted long shadows across Jack Williams' front porch as he sat in his worn wooden rocking chair. Steam rose from his coffee mug, dancing in the crisp air before disappearing. The countryside stretched out before him, rolling hills dotted with trees just starting to show their fall colors. Jack reached for the leather-bound journal on the small table beside him. His hand trembled slightly as he opened it, revealing pages filled with scattered thoughts and half-remembered dreams. Last night's entry was just 3 words: sand, heat, shadow. The peaceful scene around him seemed to crack whenever his mind wandered back to his military days. He picked up his pen, trying to capture the fragments that floated through his mind, but the memory slipped away like water through his fingers. Later that day, Jack loaded several boxes of supplies into his truck and drove to the local animal shelter. He'd started making these donations monthly. It gave him something to focus on besides his thoughts. As he helped unload the boxes, movement in a corner caught his eye. A chocolate Labrador lay curled up on a worn bed. His unseeing eyes pointed toward the wall. Despite the noise and activity in the shelter, the dog remained perfectly still and calm. "That's Charlie," Sarah, one of the shelter workers, said as she noticed Jack's interest. "He's been with us for almost 4 months now." She walked over to the enclosure, and Charlie's tail thumped gently against his bed. "He lost his sight in an accident, and most people aren't willing to take on a blind dog." Jack watched as Sarah petted Charlie's head. The dog's gentle demeanor stirred something in him, a recognition he couldn't quite place. "Can I meet him?" Jack asked, surprising himself. Minutes later, he sat on the floor while Charlie carefully explored him with his nose. The dog's movements were deliberate and graceful, despite his blindness. "I'll take him," Jack said suddenly, the words coming out before he'd even fully formed the thought. The drive home was quiet, except for Jack's voice, as he talked softly to his new companion. "It's just me out there, Charlie. Pretty quiet place. Might be good for both of us." He glanced down at the dog sitting calmly in the passenger seat. "Been keeping to myself too much lately. Maybe we can figure things out together." As if in response, Charlie shifted closer and rested his head on Jack's lap. Jack felt something in his chest loosen, a tightness he hadn't even realized was there. With one hand on the steering wheel and the other gently scratching behind Charlie's ears, Jack drove them both home. At home, Jack set up a bed for Charlie, making sure he has everything he could ever need. After taking care of all of this, man and the dog both head to bed. The next morning, sunlight filtered through Jack's bedroom window, rousing him from sleep. As he opened his door, he found Charlie lying patiently beside it, head raised at the sound of Jack's footsteps. "Well, good morning to you, too," Jack said softly, reaching down to scratch behind Charlie's ears. The dog's tail thumped against the hardwood floor in a steady rhythm. They fell into an easy routine over the next few days. Each morning began with a walk around Jack's property, their footsteps crunching through fallen leaves. Charlie moved with surprising confidence, his nose working overtime to map out their path. Sometimes he would pause to investigate an interesting scent, and Jack found himself slowing down to match his companion's pace, something he hadn't done in years. In the evenings, Jack would settle into his armchair by the fireplace, the crackling flames casting warm shadows across the room. Charlie would curl up nearby, his steady breathing adding to the peaceful atmosphere. Jack noticed how his own breathing would slow to match Charlie's, the tension in his shoulders gradually melting away. What amazed Jack most was how effortlessly Charlie navigated the house. The dog seemed to have an uncanny awareness of his surroundings, never bumping into furniture or losing his way. He would follow Jack from room to room, somehow knowing exactly where to step and when to turn. "You're something else, you know that?" Jack commented one evening as Charlie smoothly maneuvered around an end table to reach his water bowl. "Like you've got some kind of sixth sense." One night, while preparing dinner in the kitchen, Jack found himself talking more than usual. Charlie lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, but ears perked up, listening. "You know, I used to be in the military," Jack said as he chopped vegetables. "Search and rescue unit." He paused, knife hovering over the cutting board as he tried to recall more details. The memories felt just out of reach, like trying to remember a dream after waking up. "There was this one mission." His voice trailed off, brow furrowing as the details slipped away like smoke through his fingers. Charlie shifted slightly at his feet, pressing a warm shoulder against Jack's ankle. The contact brought Jack back to the present moment. "Ah, well," he said, shaking his head and returning to his cooking. "That was a long time ago now. Some memories just fade with time, I suppose." He looked down at Charlie, who remained a steady, calming presence beside him. "At least I've got good company these days." The morning sun cast dappled shadows through the trees as Jack and Charlie set out for their daily walk. The air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers and fresh grass. Jack had settled into a comfortable pace, but suddenly Charlie's behavior changed. The usually calm dog began pulling at his leash with unexpected determination. "Hey, easy there," Jack said. But Charlie continued to tug, his nose pointed firmly in one direction. Curious about what had captured Charlie's attention so strongly, Jack decided to follow his lead. The dog guided them off their usual path, weaving through a cluster of oak trees until they emerged at the edge of a small pond. The water's surface gleamed like polished glass, disturbed only by the occasional ripple from a dragonfly touching down. Jack felt an odd sensation wash over him as he stood at the water's edge. Something about this place tugged at the corners of his mind, like a half-remembered dream. He scanned the shoreline, taking in the cattails swaying in the gentle breeze and the worn rocks dotting the water's edge. Each detail felt strangely familiar, yet he couldn't remember ever visiting this spot before. Charlie sat down at the pond's edge, his posture alert and focused. His blind eyes were fixed on the water, as if he could see something Jack couldn't. Minutes ticked by, and the dog remained perfectly still, showing no interest in moving away. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked, kneeling beside his companion. "What do you see?" But Charlie just sat there, maintaining his silent vigil. Jack tried to dismiss it as nothing more than a dog's natural curiosity about water, but something about Charlie's behavior felt deliberate, almost purposeful. The strange familiarity of the pond nagged at him like an itch he couldn't quite scratch. After some time, Jack gently tugged on Charlie's leash. "Come on, buddy. Time to head back." That evening, settled in his favorite chair, Jack pulled out his journal. Charlie lay at his feet as Jack began to write, his pen moving steadily across the paper. "Found a pond today during our walk. Charlie led me there. Seemed drawn to it somehow. Can't shake the feeling I've been there before, but can't remember when or why. The way the sunlight hit the water, the arrangement of rocks along the shore. It all feels significant somehow." Charlie sat there for the longest time, completely still, like he was waiting for something. Never seen him act quite like that before. Jack paused in his writing and looked down at Charlie. "What is it about that pond, huh? Why does it feel so familiar?" Charlie lifted his head at the sound of Jack's voice, but offered no answers. The mystery of their shared connection to the pond lingered in the air between them, unspoken and unexplained. The next day, Jack makes a visit to the vet. The veterinary clinic's waiting room was quiet, except for the gentle whir of an air conditioner and the occasional shuffle of papers at the front desk. Jack sat in one of the well-worn chairs, his hand resting on Charlie's head as they waited for their appointment. Charlie remained calm, sensing his owner's reassuring presence. "Charlie Williams," called the receptionist, and Jack led his companion through to the examination room. Dr. Martinez greeted them with a warm smile. "How's our favorite patient doing today?" She knelt to give Charlie a gentle pat before beginning her examination. As she checked Charlie's eyes, she paused thoughtfully. "You know, Jack, there have been some remarkable advances in veterinary ophthalmology recently," she said, straightening up. "Given Charlie's condition, he might be a good candidate for corrective surgery." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "Surgery? You mean he could see again?" "There's a good chance, yes. The procedure has shown promising results in similar cases." Dr. Martinez explained the details, pointing out diagrams on her tablet. "However," she added carefully, "it is an expensive procedure, typically running around $12,000. Jack's excitement dimmed slightly at the figure, but he couldn't shake the image of Charlie being able to see the world around him. "Thank you, Doctor. I'll definitely think about it." Over the next few weeks, Jack threw himself into saving money. He canceled his streaming subscriptions, started brewing coffee at home instead of buying it, and picked up odd jobs around the neighborhood. His military pension covered the basics, but every extra dollar went into a special account he'd labeled Charlie's Fund. Mr. Peterson needed his fence repaired. Jack was there with his toolbox. Mrs. Thompson's gutters needed cleaning. Jack borrowed a ladder and got to work. Each job brought him closer to his goal, no matter how small the payment. Every evening, he'd return home tired but satisfied, greeted by Charlie's enthusiastic welcome. The dog's tail would thump against the floor as soon as he heard Jack's truck in the driveway, and he'd wait patiently by the door until Jack came inside. One quiet evening, Jack settled into his favorite armchair by the fireplace. The flames crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the room. Charlie lay at his feet, content as Jack gently scratched behind his ears. "You know what, buddy?" Jack said softly. "We're getting closer to making this happen. The surgery's going to be expensive, but you're worth every penny." He leaned down closer to Charlie. "Just think. You might be able to see all the places we walked together, maybe even that pond you like so much." Charlie lifted his head at the sound of Jack's voice and let out a soft, appreciative bark. The sound made Jack smile, reinforcing his determination. This was more than just helping his dog. It was about giving his friend a whole new way to experience the world, Jack thought as he headed to bed. The early morning sun hadn't yet cleared the horizon when Jack opened his eyes. He didn't need an alarm clock anymore. His internal clock and Charlie's consistent routine made sure of that. As he swung his legs out of bed, he already knew what he would find. Sure enough, Charlie was waiting patiently by the front door, his tail beginning to wag at the sound of Jack's approaching footsteps. Jack couldn't help but smile at the predictability of it all. There was something comforting about having these small certainties in his life. "Right on schedule, buddy," Jack said, reaching for Charlie's leash. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of late summer flowers and fresh grass. They started down their usual path, Charlie's nose occasionally twitching at interesting smells. About halfway through their walk, Charlie's demeanor changed. His steps became more purposeful, and he began pulling gently but insistently on the leash. Jack knew exactly where they were headed, the pond. It had become a regular part of their morning routine, though Jack still couldn't explain why. The water was still, reflecting the pink-tinged clouds like a mirror. Charlie sat at the edge, his blind eyes fixed on the pond as if he could see every ripple. Jack watched in fascination as his usually active companion became completely still, appearing to focus intently on something Jack couldn't perceive. "What do you see out there, boy?" Jack murmured, though he knew Charlie couldn't actually see anything. The question had become a habit during these peaceful moments by the water. The stillness was therapeutic, and Jack found himself grateful for these quiet interludes, even if he didn't understand them. After their walk, they returned home, and Jack moved around the kitchen preparing breakfast. The coffee maker gurgled cheerfully while he measured out Charlie's food and started making his own toast. "You know," he said, glancing down at Charlie, who sat attentively near his food bowl, "we're getting closer to affording that surgery. Dr. Martinez says the success rate is pretty good." He pulled some eggs from the refrigerator. "Maybe soon you'll be able to see all these places we visit." Charlie's head tilted to one side, ears perked forward, appearing to hang on every word. The gesture made Jack chuckle. It was as if the dog truly understood what he was saying. "Look at you, acting like you know exactly what I'm talking about," Jack said, reaching down to scratch behind Charlie's ears. The bond he felt with this dog sometimes caught him by surprise. It wasn't just companionship anymore. There was something deeper, something he couldn't quite explain. The afternoon sun streamed through the small attic window the next day, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. Jack stood in the cramped space, surrounded by cardboard boxes and old furniture draped in sheets. He'd been meaning to organize the attic for months, but something had always held him back. Charlie lay at the bottom of the ladder, waiting patiently as Jack sorted through years of accumulated memories. A plain brown box tucked in the corner caught his attention. The military stamp on its side made his stomach tighten unexpectedly. Jack reached for it, his hands hesitating just above the lid. Something about that box made him uneasy, like the feeling just before a storm breaks. "It's just old papers," he muttered to himself, finally lifting the lid. Inside, he found his service medals nestled in their cases, still shining despite the years of storage. Beneath them lay a stack of photographs and a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. Jack settled cross-legged on the attic floor and began sorting through the photos. Each image sparked a hint of recognition, but the details felt just out of reach. There were faces he knew he should remember, fellow soldiers smiling at the camera, group shots in front of military vehicles, casual moments in the mess hall. But the stories behind them remained frustratingly unclear, like trying to recall the details of a dream after waking. His hands froze on one particular photograph. A young black Labrador stood beside him, wearing a military vest with official patches. The dog's stance was alert, professional, yet there was obvious affection in the way it leaned against Jack's leg. The sight of it made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. Jack stared at the photo, willing the memory to become clearer. But like all the others, it remained stubbornly distant, shrouded in a mental fog he couldn't penetrate. The harder he tried to remember, the more the details seemed to slip away. From downstairs, he heard Charlie's soft whine. The sound snapped him out of his thoughts, and he quickly returned the photo to the box. His hand shook slightly as he closed the lid. Walking to his bedroom, he pulled open his dresser drawer and tucked the box inside, pushing it toward the back. That night, Jack's sleep was restless. His dreams were filled with chaos, the sharp crack of gunfire, urgent shouting, and the persistent barking of dogs. Through it all, he felt a crushing sense of responsibility and fear. He jerked awake in the early hours of the morning, his t-shirt damp with sweat and his heart racing. Charlie's cold nose pressed against his hand in the darkness. Jack took a deep breath, grateful for the dog's steady presence as he tried to shake off the lingering unease from his dream. The veterinary clinic's waiting room buzzed with quiet activity as Jack sat with Charlie at his feet the next day. His fingers absently stroked Charlie's ears, a gesture that had become second nature over their time together. When Dr. Peterson called them in, Charlie rose smoothly, already familiar with the clinic's layout from previous visits. "So, you've decided to go ahead with the surgery?" Dr. Peterson smiled warmly as she settled behind her desk. The morning sun filtered through her office window, catching the silver in her hair. "Yes," Jack replied, his voice firm despite the nervous flutter in his stomach. "I've saved enough for the procedure." Dr. Peterson nodded and pulled out several documents. "The success rate is very encouraging, about 90%. But I want to make sure you understand the risks and recovery process." She outlined the procedure step by step, using simple terms that helped ease Jack's concerns. Back home, Jack began implementing the pre-surgery routines Dr. Peterson had suggested. He practiced gentle touches around Charlie's eyes, helping him get comfortable with the handling he'd need during recovery. Charlie remained patient through it all, as if he somehow understood the importance of these new rituals. "You're going to have to wear one of these after surgery, buddy," Jack explained, holding up the protective cone. Charlie sniffed it cautiously, his tail wagging slowly. Jack rewarded him with a treat, amazed at how readily the dog adapted to each new challenge. They spent the afternoon practicing the eye cleaning routine using saline drops. Jack marveled at Charlie's trust, how the dog remained still under his touch. Each small success filled Jack with a sense of accomplishment he hadn't experienced in years. That evening, Jack built a fire in the hearth, its warmth filling the living room. Charlie lay in his usual spot on the rug, his breathing steady and content. Jack settled into his armchair, watching the flames dance, as he considered how much his life had changed since Charlie's arrival. The emptiness that had once filled his days had been replaced by purpose, morning walks, training sessions, and quiet moments of companionship. Even the task of saving for the surgery had given him a focus he'd been missing since leaving the military. "You know something, Charlie," Jack said softly, leaning forward in his chair. "I thought I was the one helping you when I brought you home. Turns out you might have been helping me just as much." Charlie's tail thumped against the floor in response, making Jack smile. The fire crackled softly as Jack reached down to scratch behind Charlie's ears. For the first time in years, he felt truly excited about the future. The surgery wasn't just about giving Charlie his sight back. It was about new beginnings for both of them. The morning dawned crisp and clear as Jack loaded Charlie's favorite blanket into the truck. His hands trembled slightly as he helped Charlie into the passenger seat, the familiar routine feeling different today. The weight of anticipation hung heavy in the air. "Easy does it, boy," Jack murmured, making sure Charlie was settled comfortably. The drive to the veterinary clinic seemed longer than usual, each mile marked by Jack's tightening grip on the steering wheel. Charlie remained calm beside him, occasionally pressing his nose against Jack's arm as if offering reassurance. The clinic's parking lot was nearly empty when they arrived, the early hour keeping most visitors away. Jack helped Charlie down from the truck, noting how the dog's usual confidence never wavered despite the unfamiliar timing of their visit. Inside, the receptionist greeted them warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Williams. Dr. Peterson is ready for Charlie whenever you are." Jack's throat tightened as he knelt beside Charlie in the waiting room. His fingers found their way to the soft fur behind Charlie's ears, their special spot. "You're going to do great, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll be right here waiting when you wake up." Charlie leaned into Jack's touch, tail wagging gently. When Dr. Peterson appeared, Charlie rose easily and followed her lead, leaving Jack standing alone in the waiting room. The hours crawled by. Jack paced the small waiting area, thumbed through outdated magazines without reading them, and checked his phone countless times. His mind wandered to their quiet evenings by the fireplace, their morning walks, the way Charlie always seemed to know exactly where to find him in the house. Would that change once Charlie could see? Would their careful routines need to be completely rebuilt? The sound of footsteps pulled Jack from his thoughts. He looked up to see Dr. Peterson approaching, her face brightening with a warm smile. "Mr. Williams," she said, "the surgery went perfectly. Charlie did wonderfully. He's stable and recovering exactly as we hoped." Relief flooded through Jack's body, making his knees weak. He followed Dr. Peterson to the recovery area, where Charlie lay on a soft bed, still groggy from the anesthesia. Bandages covered his eyes, but his tail thumped weakly against the bed when he heard Jack's footsteps. "Hey there, buddy," Jack said softly, reaching out to stroke Charlie's fur. "You did it. We're going to have so many bright days ahead." Charlie pressed his head into Jack's palm, the familiar gesture bringing tears to Jack's eyes. The drive home from the clinic was slower than usual, with Jack carefully avoiding every bump and pothole. Charlie lay quietly in the back seat, still groggy from the surgery, the protective cone around his neck making soft scratching sounds against the leather seats. "Almost home, buddy," Jack said softly, glancing in the rearview mirror. When they arrived, Jack helped Charlie out of the truck with gentle hands, guiding him up the porch steps and into the house. Charlie's usual confidence was replaced by hesitant movements, his paws sliding carefully across the wooden floors as he adjusted to the weight of the cone and the bandages around his eyes. Jack had prepared a soft bed near the couch, complete with Charlie's favorite blanket and a water bowl within easy reach. He helped Charlie settle in, his heart aching at how vulnerable his friend looked. "There you go," Jack whispered, running his hand along Charlie's back. "Just rest now." The next morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the windows. Following Dr. Peterson's instructions, Jack carefully removed the bandages from Charlie's eyes. His hands shook slightly as he unwound the last layer. "Okay, boy," Jack said, his voice gentle. "You can open your eyes now." Charlie blinked slowly, his eyes adjusting to the light. He looked around the room, taking in his surroundings with newfound sight. Jack held his breath, waiting for Charlie to turn toward him. When Charlie finally looked at Jack, something changed. The dog's body went rigid, his usual relaxed demeanor vanishing in an instant. His tail, which normally wagged at the sight of Jack, remained still. Before Jack could reach out, Charlie turned away abruptly, retreating to a corner of the room. "Charlie?" Jack's voice cracked with confusion and hurt. He took a step forward, but Charlie only pressed himself further into the corner, as if trying to disappear. Throughout the day, Charlie maintained his distance. When Jack entered a room, Charlie would leave it. During feeding time, he waited until Jack stepped away from his bowl before approaching. The comfortable routine they'd built together crumbled with each passing hour. As evening settled in, Jack sat alone on the couch, staring at the empty space by the fireplace where Charlie usually lay. The room felt colder somehow, despite the flames dancing in the hearth. Jack's chest tightened as he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The surgery was supposed to improve Charlie's life, not destroy their bond. He watched as Charlie slunk past the doorway, heading for his new hiding spot under the dining room table. The dog didn't even glance in his direction. "What did I do wrong?" Jack whispered to the empty room, the crackling fire his only response. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard as Jack clipped Charlie's leash to his collar. Though the dog still wouldn't meet his eyes, he stood quietly for the familiar routine. Jack's heart ached at the distance between them. But he remembered Dr. Peterson's advice about giving Charlie time to adjust to his restored vision. "Ready for our walk, boy?" Jack kept his voice gentle, trying to hide the hurt when Charlie turned his head away. They started down their usual path, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. The morning air was crisp, and birds called from the trees above. Everything seemed normal until they neared the pond. Charlie's behavior changed instantly. The dog lunged forward with unexpected force, nearly pulling the leash from Jack's grip. His barking echoed across the water, sharp and urgent. Jack had never heard Charlie make such intense sounds before. "Whoa! Easy there!" Jack struggled to maintain his footing as Charlie dragged him toward the water's edge. At the pond, Charlie planted himself firmly by the water, his eyes fixed on the surface. His reflection rippled back at him, and his barking grew even more frantic. Jack tried to quiet him, placing a steadying hand on his back. But Charlie shrugged it off, continuing his agitated barking at the water. "Charlie, it's okay," Jack said, kneeling beside him. "It's just your reflection." But Charlie wouldn't be calmed. His entire body trembled with the force of his barking, and his eyes never left the water's surface. Jack felt a chill run down his spine at the unusual display. This wasn't the peaceful pond visits they'd shared before. This was something different, something desperate. After several minutes of failed attempts to calm Charlie, Jack gently tugged the leash. "Come on, boy. Let's head home." Charlie resisted at first, his paws digging into the soft earth by the pond's edge. When Jack finally managed to lead him away, the dog kept looking back over his shoulder, whining softly. Back at the house, Charlie's strange behavior continued. Instead of settling into his usual spot by the fireplace, he paced restlessly near the front door. His nails clicked against the hardwood as he moved back and forth, occasionally stopping to stare at the door before resuming his anxious movement. Jack watched from the kitchen, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. Something about Charlie's behavior felt significant, like the dog was trying to tell him something important. But what? The peaceful companion he'd known for months had transformed into this anxious, distant creature, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the pond had something to do with it. Jack moved through the house with nervous energy, dusting surfaces and reorganizing shelves that didn't need organizing. His eyes kept drifting to Charlie, who continued his restless pacing by the door. The strange behavior at the pond had left Jack unsettled, driving him to seek comfort in mundane tasks. As he tidied his bedroom dresser, his hand brushed against the drawer where he'd stored the military box. He paused, feeling an inexplicable pull toward those old memories. With slightly trembling fingers, he pulled out the worn cardboard box and sat on the edge of his bed. "Maybe there's something I'm missing," he muttered to himself, lifting the lid. The familiar scent of old paper and metal wafted up as he began sorting through the contents. His service medals clinked together as he moved them aside, focusing instead on the stack of photographs. Each image stirred vague feelings of recognition, but the details remained frustratingly out of reach. Then he found it again, the photo of himself with the young Labrador. This time, instead of quickly putting it away, he forced himself to study it closely. The dog stood proud in its military vest, alert and ready for duty. Jack's finger traced the edge of the image, noting details he'd missed before. His breath caught in his throat. There, on the dog's left ear, was a distinctive scar, a small notch that curved inward, exactly like the one Charlie had. Jack's hands began to shake as he held the photo closer to his face, his mind spinning with the impossible coincidence. Suddenly, fragments of memory burst through the fog in his mind. The sound of urgent barking echoed in his ears, accompanied by the chaos of explosions. A name surfaced from the depths of his consciousness: Shadow. The room seemed to tilt slightly as more pieces emerged. training sessions, long nights on patrol, the unwavering loyalty of his canine partner. But the memories remained incomplete, like a puzzle with missing pieces. Jack looked up to find Charlie had wandered into the bedroom, keeping his distance, but watching intently. With slow movements, Jack held up the photograph next to Charlie's face, comparing the features. The scar was identical. The shape of the head, the slope of the shoulders, even the way the dog held himself seemed eerily familiar. "It can't be," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. He sat in stunned silence, alternating between studying the photograph and looking at Charlie. Questions raced through his mind. How could this be possible? Was Charlie actually Shadow? But Shadow had died during that final mission, hadn't he? The fragments of memory refused to align into a clear picture, leaving Jack with more questions than answers. Charlie, or Shadow, lay down near the doorway, his eyes fixed on Jack with an intensity that felt both familiar and strange. The morning sun cast long shadows across the countryside as Jack and Charlie made their way to the pond. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh grass. Jack's mind was heavy with questions from his discovery the previous night, making each step feel uncertain. As soon as they reached the water's edge, Charlie's demeanor changed dramatically. His body tensed, and he began barking at the pond with the same intensity as before. The sound echoed across the still water, breaking the morning quiet. "Easy, boy," Jack said softly, watching as Charlie paced along the shoreline. The dog's behavior seemed more purposeful than distressed, as if he was trying to communicate something important. Jack knelt beside Charlie, placing a gentle hand on his back. "What is it? What are you trying to tell me?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Without warning, Charlie began digging frantically at a spot near the water's edge. His paws threw dirt and small stones in all directions, his determination evident in every movement. Jack watched in amazement as Charlie dug with increasing urgency. "Hold on, let me help you," Jack said, moving closer. He began clearing away the loosened earth with his hands, working alongside Charlie. The wet soil caked under his fingernails as they dug deeper. His fingers brushed against something solid, something metal. Jack's heart began to race as he carefully cleared away more dirt. There, partially buried in the mud, lay a military badge. His hands trembled as he lifted it from the earth, wiping away the grime with his thumb. The badge was weathered, but still legible. Jack's name was clearly visible on its surface, the letters bringing with them a rush of buried memories. His mind suddenly filled with vivid images, the sound of helicopter rotors, the chaos of gunfire, and Shadow's desperate barking during their final mission together. The memory hit him like a physical force. He remembered now, losing the badge during a rushed extraction, Shadow refusing to leave the area despite Jack's commands. The confusion, the noise, the separation. Jack looked at Charlie, no Shadow, with new understanding. The dog sat quietly now, watching him with knowing eyes. The impossible truth settled over Jack like a wave. His loyal partner hadn't been lost after all. Through some miracle, they had found their way back to each other. "Shadow?" Jack whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The dog's tail wagged slightly at the sound of his old name, and he moved closer to Jack, pressing his head against Jack's chest, just as he used to do years ago. Jack sat by the pond's edge, the muddy badge heavy in his hands. The morning sun glinted off its tarnished surface as he turned it over and over, each rotation bringing forth another fragment of memory. The sound of helicopter blades cut through his mind, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire and urgent shouting. "Shadow!" he whispered, looking at the dog beside him. Charlie's ears perked up at the name, and his tail gave a slight wag. The fog that had shrouded Jack's memories for so long began to lift, revealing pieces of that fateful day the urgent evacuation, the chaos, and his faithful companion's determined barking. Back at home, Jack's hands trembled as he retrieved the military box from the drawer. This time, instead of pushing away the discomfort, he embraced it, spreading the contents across his kitchen table. Photos, medals, and documents told the story of his service. The reality of it struck him like a physical blow. Charlie wasn't just any shelter dog. He was Shadow, his partner from years ago. Jack sank into a kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the truth. Guilt washed over him as he remembered giving the order for Shadow to fall back, remembered the confusion of the extraction, remembered leaving without knowing what had happened to his loyal companion. The dog he'd thought dead had somehow found his way back to him. That evening, as the sun set outside his window, Jack sat on the floor next to Charlie's bed. The dog watched him with those knowing eyes, the same eyes that had drawn Jack to him at the shelter. Jack's throat felt tight as he struggled to find the right words. "I'm so sorry, Shadow," he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. "I never meant to leave you behind. Everything happened so fast and His voice cracked, and he had to pause to collect himself. "I've carried that guilt every day since." Charlie, Shadow, lifted his head and nudged Jack's hand with his nose, a gesture so familiar it made Jack's chest ache. The dog's forgiveness seemed to radiate through the gentle touch, but Jack couldn't shake the uncertainty. Did Shadow truly understand? Could he really forgive such a profound betrayal? The next morning dawned crisp and clear as Jack clipped Charlie's leash on with trembling fingers. Instead of their usual short route around the property, he headed toward the rolling hills behind his house. His heart pounded as he considered what he was about to try. Once they reached a clearing, Jack took a deep breath. "Shadow, heel," he commanded, using the firm but gentle tone from his military days. Charlie's ears twitched, and he paused, head tilting slightly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the dog moved to Jack's left side, assuming the precise position they'd practiced hundreds of times years ago. Jack's throat tightened. He tried another command. "Search pattern." Charlie hesitated, his tail lowering slightly. Jack repeated it, and this time Charlie began moving in a zigzag pattern, though his movements were less precise than they once had been. It was like watching someone remember an old dance. The basic steps were there, but the timing was off. They made their way to the pond, where Jack decided to test Charlie's tracking abilities. He placed his handkerchief behind a tree and gave the search command. Charlie's nose immediately went to work, and within moments, he'd located the hidden item. His tail wagged as he sat beside it, waiting for acknowledgement, just as he'd been trained. Jack's eyes welled up as he watched his old partner's instincts kick in. Though some commands were met with confusion, others sparked immediate recognition. It wasn't perfect. Years had passed, and they both had changed, but the foundation of their partnership remained. Near the pond's edge, Charlie's responses grew sharper, more confident. When Jack called out, "Perimeter check," Charlie circled the area with growing enthusiasm, his movements becoming more fluid with each repetition. Jack felt hope surge through him as he watched Shadow, his shadow, emerge more clearly through Charlie's actions. The walk home felt different from their recent outings. Instead of maintaining his distance, Charlie stayed close to Jack's leg, occasionally brushing against him as they walked. It was a far cry from the avoidance of the past few days, and Jack recognized it as the olive branch it was. Each step together felt like mending a small piece of their broken trust. And though Jack knew they had a long way to go, this simple closeness meant everything. Back at home, Jack sat at his desk, surrounded by old journals and his laptop. His fingers flew across the keyboard, searching through military records and news articles. Charlie lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to watch Jack's movements. "There has to be something here," Jack muttered, flipping through a weathered journal. His eyes caught on a mention of the Warrior Dogs Rehabilitation Program that operated in the same region where he'd lost Shadow. The program specialized in helping injured military dogs transition to civilian life. Jack's heart raced as he read about their work with traumatized and wounded service animals. With trembling hands, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Tony, it's Jack Williams." He ran his fingers through his hair as he waited for his old friend's response. "I need your help with something about that last mission." Tony's voice crackled through the speaker. "Jack? Man, it's been forever. What's going on?" Jack explained about Charlie, the surgery, and his suspicions about Shadow. There was a long pause before Tony spoke again. "Hold on, let me check some files." Jack could hear papers rustling in the background. "Yeah, I found something," Tony finally said. After the explosion, Shadow was picked up by a local rescue team. They transferred him to that rehabilitation program you mentioned. Tony cleared his throat. "But here's the thing. About 6 months into his rehabilitation, Shadow disappeared. Just vanished one night. They searched for weeks but never found him." Jack's stomach churned as Tony continued. "The reports say he was showing signs of improvement, but he kept trying to return to the last place he'd seen you. They think he was looking for you." The weight of this information hit Jack like a physical blow. He looked down at Charlie, remembering how the dog had led him to the pond, the very place where they'd been separated. All those years, Shadow had been searching for him, waiting by that pond, while Jack had been living just over the hill, his memories of their partnership buried under trauma and guilt. "I failed him, Tony," Jack's voice cracked. "He was my responsibility, my partner, and he spent years thinking I'd abandoned him." "You were injured too, Jack. You lost your memory. You couldn't have known." "I should have looked harder," Jack interrupted, his free hand clenching into a fist. "I should have." He trailed off as Charlie pressed against his leg, looking up at him with concerned eyes. After ending the call, Jack sat in silence, the truth of what had happened settling heavily on his shoulders. Charlie, Shadow, had spent years alone, searching for him, while Jack had been living with blocked memories less than a mile away. The thought of his loyal partner waiting by that pond, day after day, made his chest ache with remorse. He slid from his chair to sit on the floor beside Charlie, who immediately moved closer. "I'm so sorry, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never meant to leave you behind." Charlie rested his head on Jack's knee, but Jack couldn't shake the crushing guilt. How could he possibly make up for years of unintended abandonment? The question weighed on him as he sat there, gently stroking Charlie's fur, the morning sun casting long shadows across the floor. That night, dark clouds gathered on the horizon as Jack prepared dinner, the distant rumble of thunder echoing across the countryside. Charlie paced near the front door, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor. His usual calm demeanor had vanished, replaced by nervous energy that made him circle the entryway again and again. Jack paused at the stove, watching Charlie's behavior with growing interest. Something about the dog's restlessness tugged at his memory. He'd seen this before, hadn't he? Not just with Charlie, but years ago, during training missions, when storms would roll in. Lightning flashed outside, followed by a loud crack of thunder. Charlie whined, pressing himself against the doorframe. Jack moved closer, kneeling beside him. "Easy, boy," he said softly, placing a gentle hand on Charlie's back. The familiar texture of his fur, the way he leaned into Jack's touch, it all felt so similar to those nights in the field. Another crash of thunder shook the house, and suddenly Jack's mind flooded with a crystal-clear memory. He was back on that fateful mission, crouched behind cover as rain poured around him. Shadow had been beside him, fur soaked and muscles tense. The dog's ears had perked up, and he'd started barking urgently, pulling at Jack's sleeve. Jack had trusted Shadow's instincts without question, moving away from their position. Seconds later, an explosion had rocked the ground where they'd been standing. Shadow's warning had saved his life. The memory hit Jack with such force that he had to steady himself against the wall. All these years, he'd carried guilt over leaving Shadow behind, but he'd forgotten the most important truth. Shadow had protected him until the very end. Even after their separation, Shadow had never stopped trying to find his way back to him. Thunder boomed overhead, and Charlie pressed closer to Jack, trembling slightly. Jack wrapped his arms around the dog, burying his face in the familiar fur. "You never gave up on me, did you?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Even when I couldn't remember, you kept searching. You found your way back." He held Charlie tighter as rain lashed against the windows. "I promise you, I'm never leaving you behind again. Never." Charlie's trembling slowly subsided as Jack held him, the storm raging outside their quiet sanctuary. For the first time since discovering Charlie's true identity, Jack felt the fog of guilt beginning to lift, replaced by a fierce determination to honor the loyalty that had brought them back together. The morning sun filtered through Jack's bedroom window, casting warm rays across his face. A gentle nudge against his hand stirred him from sleep, and he opened his eyes to find Charlie standing beside the bed, tail wagging with enthusiasm. Jack blinked in surprise. This was the first time since the surgery that Charlie had shown such eagerness for their morning routine. "Well, look who's ready for a walk," Jack said, his voice still rough with sleep. Charlie's tail wagged faster, and he picked up his leash from the floor, dropping it onto the bed. The familiar gesture made Jack's heart swell. Jack dressed quickly, not wanting to dampen Charlie's spirits. The morning air was crisp and clean as they stepped outside, Charlie leading the way down their usual path to the pond. At the water's edge, Jack noticed a fallen branch nearby. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands as an idea formed. Charlie watched him intently, head tilted to one side. "What do you say, boy? Want to play fetch?" Jack tossed the stick a few feet, testing Charlie's interest. The dog's ears perked up, but he didn't move. Jack retrieved the stick and moved closer to the water's edge. "Come on, Shadow," he said softly, using the old name. "Remember how much you loved swimming?" He threw the stick into the shallow part of the pond, where it landed with a gentle splash. Charlie stood at the water's edge, shifting from paw to paw. His tail wagged uncertainly as he watched the stick floating nearby. "It's okay," Jack encouraged. "Go get it, boy." After another moment's hesitation, Charlie stepped forward. His paws touched the water, and then suddenly he was splashing through it, paddling confidently toward the stick. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he watched Charlie grab the branch and swim back, looking every bit like the strong military dog he'd once been. Charlie dropped the stick at Jack's feet, shaking water from his fur. His tail wagged furiously now, and he looked up at Jack with bright eyes that seemed to say, "Throw it again." Jack couldn't help himself. He laughed. The sound surprised him. It had been so long since he'd felt this kind of pure joy. He threw the stick again, and Charlie bounded after it without hesitation this time. They played like this for nearly an hour, Charlie splashing and swimming while Jack's laughter echoed across the pond. It reminded Jack of training days long ago, when Shadow would cool off in streams after their exercises. As the morning grew warmer, Jack finally clipped the leash back onto Charlie's collar. The dog was still wagging his tail, even though his fur was soaked and dripping. They started the walk home, both tired but happy, and Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years, real hope for their future together. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Jack's front porch as he and Charlie relaxed in their usual spots. Jack in his wooden rocking chair and Charlie sprawled at his feet. The crunch of tires on gravel caught their attention as an unfamiliar car pulled into the driveway. A woman in her mid-40s stepped out, her posture straight and purposeful. Charlie's ears perked up as she approached, but he remained calm. "Jack Williams?" she called out. "I'm Karen Mitchell from the Military Working Dog Rescue Organization. Tony Thompson told me I might find you here." Jack stood, his expression curious but guarded. "Yes, that's me." Karen climbed the porch steps, her eyes fixed on Charlie. "And this must be the dog Tony mentioned." She smiled warmly. "The one you call Charlie now, but who might have once been Shadow." Jack gestured for her to take a seat in the empty chair beside him. "Tony mentioned you might have some information about what happened to him?" Karen nodded, settling into the chair. "We found him about 5 miles from where your mission took place. He was injured and exhausted, but alive, clutching this badge." She paused, reaching into her bag for her phone to show a photo of a very familiar badge to Jack. "He wouldn't let go of it at first," Karen continued. "We had to wait until he fell asleep to carefully remove it from his mouth. We kept it as evidence, hoping we might one day find his handler. But when he disappeared, the badge disappeared with him." Charlie moved closer to Karen as she spoke, as if remembering her. She reached down to scratch behind his ears. "We nursed him back to health over several weeks. His injuries healed well, but his eyes—" She trailed off. The blast damage was already done, but he was resilient, adapting quickly to his loss of sight. Jack leaned forward, hanging on every word. "What happened then?" "One morning he was just gone," Karen said, shaking her head. "We searched everywhere, put up notices, but nothing. We assumed the worst until months later when we heard reports of a blind lab being brought to various shelters in the region. By the time we followed up on any lead, he'd already been moved or transferred." She smiled at Charlie. "Looks like he was trying to find his way back to you all along. The shelter where you found him must have been the last stop on his journey." Jack sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the revelation. He watched as Charlie rested his head on Karen's knee, accepting gentle pets from his former caretaker. "Thank you," Jack said softly, "for taking care of him and for coming here to tell me this." Karen stood, gathering her bag. "It's what we do, and it's good to see you two found each other again." Jack walked her to her car, Charlie following close behind. As they watched her drive away, Jack looked down at his companion with new eyes, marveling at the determination and loyalty that had driven Shadow to survive and somehow find his way back to him. The morning after Karen's visit, Jack sat at his kitchen table with a blank piece of paper before him. Charlie dozed nearby in a patch of sunlight streaming through the window. The idea had come to him during a restless night, a way to help others find the same healing he and Charlie had discovered together. He picked up his pen and began writing, addressing the letter to the local veterans support group. The words flowed easily as he described his own struggles after returning from service, the fractured memories, the isolation, the sense of being lost. He explained how finding Charlie had changed everything, not knowing at first that this blind, gentle dog was actually his former partner Shadow. "It wasn't just coincidence that brought us together," he wrote, pausing to glance at Charlie. "It was a second chance for both of us." Over the next few days, Jack refined the letter, carefully crafting his proposal. He envisioned a program that would help connect veterans with rescued military dogs, particularly those who might have worked together in service. He described how these bonds could help heal invisible wounds on both sides. At his desk, surrounded by crumpled drafts, Jack detailed his and Charlie's journey. He wrote about the initial connection at the shelter, the mysterious pull to the pond, and the gradual unveiling of their shared past. He explained how Charlie's presence had helped him confront his own forgotten memories, while his care for Charlie had given him a renewed sense of purpose. "These dogs aren't just pets," he wrote. "They're brothers in arms who deserve the same chance at healing that we do. And sometimes they're the very partners we thought we'd lost." Charlie padded over and rested his head on Jack's knee as he worked on the final draft. Jack smiled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. The letter felt right, honest and hopeful, born from their shared experience. When he finally sealed the envelope, Jack felt lighter. He drove to the post office with Charlie in the passenger seat, just as they'd done on that first day together. After dropping the letter in the mailbox, they returned home as the afternoon sun began to set. Jack settled into his favorite chair by the fireplace, watching as Charlie curled up in his usual spot on the rug. The warm glow of the flames illuminated them both as Jack silently promised to help other veterans and dogs find their way back to each other, just as he and Charlie had done. A week after mailing his letter, Jack found an envelope from the Veterans Group in his mailbox. Charlie watched attentively as Jack's hands trembled slightly while opening it. The response was better than he'd hoped. They wanted him to present his idea at their next meeting, just 3 days away. Jack spent the next few days preparing his speech at his kitchen table, reading aloud while Charlie listened patiently. He carefully chose each word, wanting to convey not just the facts of their story, but the deep emotional impact of their reunion. "How's this sound, buddy?" Jack asked, clearing his throat as he practiced. Charlie's tail thumped against the floor in response, making Jack smile despite his nerves. When the evening of the meeting arrived, Jack adjusted his tie in the mirror one last time. Charlie sat beside him, wearing his therapy dog vest, a suggestion from the group coordinator to help illustrate their vision for the program. The community center was packed with veterans and local residents. Jack recognized some faces from around town, while others were new to him. As he took his place at the podium, Charlie settled calmly at his feet, a steady presence that helped calm Jack's racing heart. "I never expected to find my military partner again," Jack began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "Especially not in a shelter, years after I thought I'd lost him forever." He shared their story, from their military service together to the mysterious way they'd reconnected, and how healing had come for both of them through their renewed bond. Throughout his speech, Jack noticed tissues being passed around the room. Several veterans nodded in understanding when he described the fog of his memories, the isolation he'd felt. Others leaned forward as he explained his vision for connecting more veterans with rescue dogs, particularly those who might have served together. When he finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Charlie wagged his tail, seeming to understand the significance of the moment. As people gathered around afterward, Jack saw the impact of their story reflected in tear-filled eyes and grateful smiles. "Your story gives me hope," one veteran said, kneeling to pet Charlie. "I lost my service dog 2 years ago, and I've never stopped wondering." Others shared similar stories or offered to help with the program. A local business owner promised to help with funding, while a retired veterinarian volunteered her services. Each conversation confirmed what Jack had hoped. Their story could make a difference. Standing there, surrounded by support and understanding, Jack felt a deep sense of purpose. Charlie pressed against his leg, and Jack reached down to scratch his ears, grateful for the journey that had brought them to this moment. Over the next few weeks, Jack threw himself into establishing second chances. He worked closely with the Veterans Group to create guidelines, set up partnerships with local shelters, and develop a system for identifying potential military dogs among rescue animals. The community center's back office became their makeshift headquarters. Jack spent hours there, surrounded by papers and photos of dogs needing homes. Charlie lounged nearby in his therapy vest, greeting everyone who came through the door with a gentle wag of his tail. "We need to be thorough," Jack explained to the volunteer committee. "These dogs might have trauma, just like the veterans they'll be paired with." He spoke from experience, remembering Charlie's initial struggles and their gradual path to healing. The program quickly gained momentum. Local businesses donated supplies, and a retired K-9 trainer offered free behavioral assessments. Jack coordinated with military contacts to trace the histories of rescued dogs, hoping to reunite more pairs like him and Charlie. At their first official event, Charlie drew attention from everyone. Veterans gathered around, asking questions about his story. Jack watched as Charlie's presence seemed to ease the tension in their shoulders, bringing smiles to faces that had looked wary when they first arrived. "He's our living proof that second chances work," Jack told them, patting Charlie's head. The dog leaned into his touch, demonstrating the trust they'd rebuilt. As weeks passed, Jack found himself spending more time at the center, meeting with veterans and helping them connect with potential companions. He recognized the look of hope in their eyes, the same one he'd had when he first saw Charlie at the shelter. During one particularly meaningful session, a young veteran named Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, speaking softly about her new companion, a German shepherd named Max. Charlie rested his head on her knee as she spoke. "I hadn't talked to my parents in months," Sarah admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "But Max, he gave me something to share with them. Something positive. I called them last week just to tell them about him, and we ended up talking for 2 hours." Jack listened intently, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. Charlie's tail thumped against the floor, as if he too understood the significance of Sarah's words. In that moment, Jack realized their story had become more than just their own. It had grown into something that could light the way for others seeking their own path to healing. Jack stared at the invitation on his kitchen counter for the third time the next morning. The elegant letterhead of the Regional Military Service Recognition Committee seemed to mock his uncertainty. Charlie patted over and nudged his hand with a wet nose. "What do you think, buddy?" Jack asked, scratching behind Charlie's ears. "Should we go?" The thought of standing in front of a crowd made his stomach twist. He'd spent so much time helping others through second chances that he'd never stopped to consider himself worthy of recognition. Charlie's steady gaze and gentle tail wag provided the reassurance he needed. The event was held in a grand hotel ballroom, decorated with American flags and photos celebrating the bond between service members and their canine partners. Jack adjusted his tie nervously as he and Charlie made their way through the crowd. Several veterans from Second Chances spotted them and waved, their own service dogs sitting attentively by their sides. "And now," the announcer's voice rang clear through the speakers, "we'd like to recognize someone who has made an extraordinary impact in our community. Jack Williams and his companion Charlie, please come to the stage." Jack's legs felt heavy as he walked forward, Charlie matching his pace perfectly. The spotlight felt warm on his face as the organizer began to speak. "Tonight, we honor a man and his dog who exemplify the very essence of loyalty, perseverance, and hope," the organizer read from a citation. Through their program, Second Chances, Jack and Charlie have helped dozens of veterans find healing through the companionship of rescue dogs. Their own remarkable journey of separation and reunion has inspired countless others to believe in the power of second chances. The words washed over Jack as he stood there, memories flooding back, finding Charlie at the shelter, discovering his true identity as Shadow, and their gradual journey back to trust. Charlie sat perfectly still beside him, his presence as steady and reassuring as always. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of service come after leaving the battlefield, the organizer continued. Through their work, they've created a legacy of hope and healing that will impact veterans and rescue dogs for years to come. As Jack accepted the Crystal Award, he looked down at Charlie, who sat tall and proud beside him. In his companion's clear eyes, Jack saw not just their past, but all they'd accomplished together. They had transformed their broken pieces into something beautiful, something that helped others find their way back to wholeness. A few days later, Jack and Charlie were out on a walk in the crisp evening air. Street lamps cast long shadows across the pavement, and the neighborhood was peaceful except for the distant sound of crickets. Charlie's ears suddenly perked up, and his body went rigid. Before Jack could process the change, Charlie let out a series of sharp, urgent barks, the kind Jack remembered from their military days. A dark sedan was idling near Mrs. Peterson's house, its headlights off. The car's engine revved, and it peeled away from the curb, tires squealing against the asphalt. As it passed under a street light, Jack caught glimpses of its details: a dented rear bumper, dark blue paint, and what looked like a missing hubcap on the passenger side. "Easy, boy," Jack said, placing a steadying hand on Charlie's back. The dog maintained his alert posture, tracking the car with his head until it disappeared around the corner. Jack's mind flashed to the community bulletin board posts he'd seen about recent break-ins. The description matched perfectly. Back at home, Jack called the police department's non-emergency line. The dispatcher took his report with interest, especially when he mentioned the car's distinctive features. "Actually, sir," the dispatcher said, "we've been looking for a vehicle matching that description. Your dog's reaction might have prevented another burglary. We'll increase patrols in your area tonight." After hanging up, Jack watched Charlie settle into his favorite spot by the fireplace. The same instincts that had saved lives overseas were still sharp as ever, still protecting and serving even in retirement. "Looks like you haven't lost your touch, partner," Jack said, reaching for the special treats he kept in the top cabinet. Charlie's tail thumped against the floor as Jack approached with the rewards. "Still watching my back after all these years, huh?" Charlie accepted the treats gently, and Jack knelt beside him, running his hands through the dog's soft fur. "You're still the best partner I could ask for," he said softly, feeling a surge of pride in his loyal companion. Days passed. The morning sun painted the countryside in warm golden hues as Jack settled into his favorite porch chair, steam rising from his coffee mug. Charlie lay contentedly at his feet, soaking in the early warmth. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the cheerful shouts of neighborhood children running past the house. "Mr. Jack, can Charlie come play with us?" Little Sarah called out, her pigtails bouncing as she waved. Jack smiled, watching as Charlie's ears perked up at the sound of the children's voices. With a gentle nod from Jack, Charlie rose and trotted over to the group of eager kids. "Just don't wear him out too much," Jack called after them, chuckling as Charlie's tail wagged with excitement. From his perch on the porch, Jack watched the scene unfold. Charlie bounded after tennis balls and sticks, his movements fluid and playful. The sound of children's laughter mixed with Charlie's happy barks filled the morning air. Jack's mind drifted to their journey together. He thought about the veterans who'd found hope through the Second Chances program, like Mike, who'd barely left his house before meeting his new companion, and Sarah's mom, Jenny, who rediscovered her smile thanks to a Gentle Shepherd mix. Each success story felt like a small miracle, born from his and Charlie's own path to healing. Reaching for his worn leather journal, Jack opened to a fresh page. His pen moved steadily across the paper as he wrote his final entry. "Dear Shadow, or Charlie, as fate would have it, you never gave up on me, even when I thought I'd lost you forever. Your forgiveness taught me that second chances aren't just possible, they're gifts waiting to be discovered. Through you, I'll learn that healing doesn't mean forgetting the past, but building something new from it. You've shown me that loyalty isn't bound by time or circumstance. Together, we've helped others find their way back from darkness, just as you helped me find my way back to myself. Every veteran and rescue dog we've brought together is part of your legacy, our legacy. Thank you for staying true, for finding your way back, and for teaching me that sometimes the best way forward is together. Jack closed the journal and placed it on the small table beside him. Rising from his chair, he walked toward the field where Charlie played with the children. He picked up a fallen branch and held it high. "Ready, boy?" he called out. Charlie's ears perked up immediately, his attention locked on Jack. With a strong throw, Jack sent the stick sailing across the field. Charlie burst into action, racing after it with joyful barks, while the children cheered him on. As Charlie sprinted back, stick proudly held in his mouth, Jack knelt down to meet him. "Let's keep going, partner," he said softly, scratching behind Charlie's ears. Together, they walked toward the horizon, their shadows stretching long behind them in the morning sun. If you enjoyed the story of Jack and Charlie, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.